Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless Official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Jack Abbott and Cain Ashby had never expected their alliance to come to this dark and dangerous crossroad, but rage, betrayal, and years of bitter rivalries had pushed them beyond the point of no return. It was a quiet night in Genoa City, but behind the gated walls of the Newman ranch, a storm of bullets and secrets was about to erupt in a way that would leave scars on families for generations to come. Jack, still haunted by decades of cutthroat battles with Victor Newman, felt as though this final step was both inevitable and unforgivable, yet he couldn't stop himself. Cain, desperate and angry after being cornered in his own life, saw Victor as the one man standing in the way of redemption and power, and that made him willing to risk everything. Together, the two men cut through the night like shadows, breaking into the sprawling Newman mansion with the kind of reckless determination that promised blood would spill. The front door wasn't enough, they slipped through the back, knowing Victor had cameras and alarms everywhere, but their nerves were raw, their adrenaline high, and the thought of victory outweighed the danger. Cain whispered harshly, reminding Jack that Victor would likely be armed, but Jack's eyes burned with the kind of fury only decades of rivalry could ignite. They weren't here to talk. They weren't here to negotiate. They came for a confrontation that could only end one way, with someone lying lifeless on the floor of the Newman estate. Inside, the silence was heavy, only broken by the tick of the ornate grandfather clock in the hallway, each chime echoing like a countdown to destruction. Cain moved first, his hand shaking as he tightened his grip on the weapon he'd brought, a gun he never thought he'd have the nerve to fire. Jack followed closely behind, the rage in his chest drowning out the rational voice in his head screaming that this was wrong. Every portrait of Victor hanging in the grand hallway seemed to mock him, staring down with that infamous Newman arrogance, as though Victor himself knew Jack was trespassing, knew Jack was crossing a line that could never be erased. Jack whispered that they needed to end this quickly before Victor's guards, or worse, his family, showed up. Cain nodded, but his jaw clenched. This wasn't just about Victor. For Cain, it was about freeing himself from being a perpetual outsider, about finally taking what had always been denied to him. His voice trembled as he muttered that Victor had ruined too many lives and tonight he would ruin no more. Jack pressed forward, his breath unsteady, his heartbeat roaring in his ears like war drums, until suddenly a shadow moved at the top of the staircase. Both men froze, and for one chilling moment the air itself seemed to stop. Then came Victor Newman's unmistakable voice, calm but sharp as a blade, slicing through the darkness. I knew it would come to this. Abbott. Ashby, what a pathetic pair you make. Victor descended the stairs slowly, his hand steady as he raised his own weapon, his black eyes narrowed with a mixture of contempt and amusement. He had survived countless betrayals, enemies, and near-death experiences before, but this was different. These were men he had underestimated in different ways, Jack, his lifelong nemesis who had always been a thorn in his empire's side, and Cain, a schemer who Victor believed lacked the spine to take such a step. But now here they were, guns pointed, eyes burning, intent on ending him in his own home. The tension cracked like lightning, and then, chaos. A shot rang out, echoing so loudly through the house that it seemed to shake the walls. Cain staggered, unsure if he had pulled the trigger or if it had been Jack or Victor, but suddenly the air was filled with smoke, sound, and the terrifying smell of gunpowder. Jack screamed for Cain to move, ducking behind the marble column, returning fire without hesitation. Victor fired back, his movements unnervingly precise for a man of his age, as though he had been waiting for this showdown his entire life. Furniture splintered, glass shattered, and the Newman mansion became a war zone of vengeance and desperation. The shouting, the gunfire, and the chaos escalated into a frenzy. Cain found himself cornered near the bar, firing blindly, his nerves unraveling as he realized they might not survive this night. Jack, consumed by years of hate, fought with deadly precision, yet with every shot he realized this wasn't about victory anymore, it was about survival. Then came the moment that would haunt Genoa City forever. A scream pierced the madness, not from Jack, not from Cain, and not from Victor, but from someone else entirely. In the confusion of the break-in and the gunfire, No one had noticed that another person had entered the house. The sound froze them all in place for a split second, enough for the reality to sink in. The bullet had struck someone. Someone unexpected. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the desperate, ragged breaths of the men who realized the nightmare had just escalated to tragedy. Victor's face paled as he lowered his weapon, his eyes wide with horror at who had fallen. Jack's gun slipped from his hand as if it suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds, while Kane stumbled forward, whispering no, no, no like a prayer that would never be answered. Someone lay motionless on the floor, blood spreading quickly across the Newman mansion's polished tiles, their identity obscured in the haze of smoke and fear. The smoke still lingered in the air, heavy and choking, as the horrifying reality began to take shape. The grand living room of the Newman mansion, once filled with luxury and pride, now resembled a battlefield. The ornate paintings on the wall, the crystal vases, the antique furniture, all of it was splintered and broken by stray bullets, shards of glass sparkling under the flickering chandelier. But none of that mattered anymore. The true devastation lay on the polished floor, where a body had crumpled, lifeless, the sound of the gunfire replaced by the eerie silence of grief and shock. Victor, Jack, and Kane stood frozen, their chests heaving, their weapons still in their hands, but their hearts pounding with an entirely new kind of terror. It wasn't Victor lying on the ground. It wasn't Jack. It wasn't Kane. It was someone who had never been meant to be a part of this bloody showdown. The fallen figure shifted slightly, groaning faintly, and all three men realized with horror that this wasn't just a casualty, it was a family member. Nikki Newman's voice echoed faintly as she crawled from the shadows toward the figure, screaming a name that shattered every ounce of bravado in Jack and Kane. Victoria! Oh my God, Victoria! Her cries were raw, breaking, filled with the kind of maternal anguish that silenced even Victor's fury. Victoria Newman, Victor's daughter, had walked into the chaos at precisely the wrong moment. The bullet, whether from Jack, Kane, or Victor himself, had struck her just above the shoulder, dangerously close to her chest. Blood poured quickly, staining her blouse and pooling around her as she struggled to breathe. Nikki clutched her daughter's hand, begging her to stay awake, begging her not to close her eyes, while Victor's face twisted into something Jack had never seen before, pure, uncontrollable fear. Jack's gun clattered to the floor, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. He had hated Victor for decades, but this was never the plan. The weight of what they had done hit him with full force, and the rage that had driven him here melted into guilt so sharp it threatened to suffocate him. Kane, equally horrified, dropped his weapon, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the pool of blood spreading larger with every second. He mumbled incoherently, shaking his head, denying the reality in front of him. I didn't shoot her, it wasn't me. God, please, it wasn't me, but the truth was lost in the chaos of overlapping gunfire. None of them knew who had pulled the trigger that hit Victoria. And maybe none of them ever would. Victor fell to his knees beside his daughter, his hand pressing firmly against her wound to stop the bleeding. His legendary stoicism cracked completely as his voice broke, calling out to Nikki and demanding someone call 911. Nikki fumbled with her phone, her tears blinding her, her fingers shaking as she tried to dial. The Newman patriarch, who had faced hostile takeovers, near-death explosions, betrayals, and even faked deaths, was now just a father, desperately trying to keep his child alive. He shouted at Jack and Kane with venom, his voice echoing like thunder. Look what you've done. You cowards, you tried to kill me, and you've shot my daughter instead. The venom in his tone was sharp enough to make both Jack and Kane flinch, their own self-loathing only deepening. Jack wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain that he never meant for this, but the words died in his throat. How could he defend the indefensible? How could he justify barging into Victor's home, guns drawn, ready to take his life? Kane, meanwhile, was unraveling quickly, panic taking over as he clutched his hair and paced frantically, muttering that they had to leave before the police arrived. His desperation was obvious, but Jack grabbed his arm, his voice hoarse. We can't leave her like this, Kane. We can't. Kane shoved him off, his fear overtaking his guilt, but the sound of sirens in the distance sealed their fate. There was no running from this. Not now. Within minutes, the mansion was swarmed. Police officers rushed inside, guns raised, shouting for everyone to drop their weapons. Paramedics stormed past them, kneeling beside Victoria as Nikki sobbed and clung to her daughter. The room became a blur of flashing lights, frantic voices, and the wail of sirens outside. Jack raised his hand slowly, surrendering, his face etched with devastation. Kane hesitated, his fight-or-flight instinct screaming at him to bolt, but Jack's glare held him still. Victor, his hand still pressed against Victoria's wound, growled through clenched teeth that both men should rot in hell for this. The scene turned into a media frenzy within hours. News vans crowded outside the Newman ranch, reporters clamoring for answers, speculating wildly about what had happened inside. The headline spread like wildfire across Genoa City: "Shootout at Newman Ranch, Victoria Newman shot during break-in." The entire town buzzed with whispers, speculation, and outrage. Families gathered around televisions, gasping at the news ticker, while phones rang endlessly as word spread. At the Abbott mansion, Ashley nearly collapsed when she saw her brother being escorted out of the Newman home in handcuffs. Tracy burst into tears, unable to comprehend how Jack could have fallen so far. At Chancellor Winters, Billy watched the news in disbelief, his mind racing between worry for Victoria and shock that his brother Jack had done something so reckless. And in the hospital waiting room, chaos erupted as the Newman family rallied, their grief and anger palpable. Nick arrived, his face pale with fury, demanding answers. Abby burst into tears, terrified for her sister. Adam, ever complicated, clenched his jaw, torn between anger at Jack and Kane and his own guilt for not being there to protect Victoria. At the heart of it all, Victoria lay in surgery, her life hanging in the balance as surgeons worked frantically to remove the bullet and repair the damage. Every passing second felt like an eternity, every silence more suffocating than the last. Nikki clung to Victor's hand, her sobs racking her body as she whispered prayers. Victor, however, was silent, his face like stone, though his eyes burned with a fury that promised vengeance. His daughter's blood was on Jack Abbott and Kane Ashby's hands, and he would not rest until they paid the ultimate price. Jack, meanwhile, sat in an interrogation room at the police station, his hands cuffed, his face pale. He replayed the night over and over in his head, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it had all spiraled out of control. He had come there for Victor. He had come to settle scores. But now, instead of ending Victor, he had destroyed Victoria. His guilt gnawed at him like acid, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fight back. Kane sat in another room, equally broken, his fear consuming him. He insisted to anyone who would listen that he hadn't fired the fatal shot, that he hadn't meant for any of this, but his protests sounded hollow. The truth was blurred, the evidence unclear, and the police were in no rush to sort through the chaos. To them, two men had broken into Victor Newman's home, opened fire, and left his daughter fighting for her life. That was all that mattered. But Genoa City thrives on secrets, and beneath the surface, more layers of the story began to unravel. Questions arose about why Kane had been with Jack in the first place, what had pushed him to align himself with Victor's greatest enemy. Rumors spread about business deals gone wrong, betrayals too deep to forgive, and the possibility that someone else had been pulling strings behind the scenes. Did Kane really want Victor dead, or had someone manipulated him into believing this was his only option? And Jack, had his hatred truly reached a boiling point, or had someone lit the match, knowing it would end in disaster? As the dust settled, one truth became clear: Genoa City would never be the same again. Families were divided, alliances shattered, and the line between justice and vengeance blurred beyond recognition. And while Victoria's fate hung in the balance, one haunting question lingered over everyone: who had fired the bullet that brought her down? Until that answer came, suspicion would poison every relationship, every glance, every whispered conversation in the halls of power. And in the dark, Victor Newman sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the hospital room door where surgeons fought to save his daughter's life. His hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight, his mind already calculating. He would find out who had done this. He would make them pay. And if it was Jack Abbott or Kane Ashby, then Victor Newman would not rest until their lives ended in the same blood and chaos they had brought into his home. The war had begun, and Genoa City was about to burn. The hospital waiting room was a powder keg. Every Newman child, every in-law, every relative that could be reached on short notice gathered there, their emotions boiling over in raw displays of anguish, anger, and shock. Nikki sat closest to the double doors that led to the operating room, her trembling hands clutching a rosary, her lips moving silently in prayer. Her makeup streaked down her cheeks, her usually composed demeanor shattered. Victor stood next to her, a pillar of cold fury. He barely moved, barely blinked, but the tension in his jaw and the dark fire in his eyes told everyone present that he was plotting already. This wasn't just about saving Victoria. This was about retribution. Nick paced like a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching as his rage bubbled dangerously close to spilling over. "I swear," he muttered to anyone within earshot, "if Victoria doesn't make it, I'll kill them both. Jack. Kane. I don't care what happens to me, I'll end them." Abby tried to calm him, but her own sobs betrayed her composure. Adam leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face hard to read. For once, there was no smugness, no detached smirk, only a complicated storm of guilt and worry. He and Victoria had fought for years, but she was his sister, and the thought of losing her hit him harder than he wanted to admit. The door swung open suddenly, and the surgeon stepped out, his scrub stained with blood, his expression grim. The room went silent. Everyone held their breath. Nikki rose halfway to her feet, her voice trembling. "Doctor, please, is she?" "She's stable," the surgeon said at last, his voice cautious but firm. The collective gasp of relief was deafening, tears spilling freely as Nikki collapsed back into her chair, sobbing into her hands. "But she's not out of the woods yet. The bullet missed her heart by less than an inch. We were able to remove it, but the next 24 hours are critical. She'll remain in intensive care. If she pulls through, she has a strong chance of recovery." The family broke into a mixture of tears, hugs, and whispered prayers of gratitude. But while Nikki and Abby clung to each other in relief, Victor's face remained unchanged. He thanked the doctor curtly, then turned his gaze toward the window that overlooked the city. His silence was more terrifying than Nick's outbursts or Nikki's sobs. Everyone knew what it meant. Victor was already thinking about revenge. Meanwhile, at the Genoa City Police Department, Jack and Kane were being processed, their mugshots taken, their fingerprints recorded. The weight of their choices bore down on them heavily. Jack sat in the interrogation room, his hands shaking as he rubbed his temples. His mind replayed the moment of the gunfire endlessly, Victor's glare, Kane's panicked movements, the sound of glass shattering, and then that scream. The scream that told him everything had gone wrong. He thought of Ashley, of Tracy, of Kyle. What would they think of him now? Would Kyle ever forgive him for nearly killing the mother of his child? Would Ashley ever look at him again without disgust? Across the hall, Kane's interrogation was far less composed. He shouted, cried, insisted repeatedly that he didn't fire the shot that hit Victoria. He accused Jack, accused Victor, even accused the chaos itself, as though the bullets had somehow acted on their own. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. To the detectives, the evidence was clear enough: Kane and Jack had broken into a man's home with guns. Whether or not they pulled the trigger that hit Victoria, they were both guilty of attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. The law didn't care about blurred memories or desperate denials. Word of their arrest spread through Genoa City like wildfire. The Abbott family was devastated. Ashley screamed in disbelief when she saw Jack's face plastered across the evening news, her brother labeled a criminal, his life's work and legacy shattered in an instant. Kyle, shaken to his core, couldn't look at Harrison without wondering how to explain that his grandfather had nearly killed the boy's grandmother. Tracy sobbed, her heart breaking as she realized the gentle, protective brother she loved had been consumed by a hatred that brought him to this. And at Chancellor Winters, Lily was in shock over Kane's involvement. She replayed every fight, every lie, every reckless move he had ever made, and still, she couldn't reconcile the man she once loved with the criminal sitting in a holding cell. Back at the hospital, tension only escalated. Billy arrived, his face pale, his voice cracking with emotion as he asked about Victoria's condition. His history with her made the situation all the more unbearable. She was not only his ex, not only the mother of his children, but a woman he had always loved in some deep, complicated way. He demanded to see her, but Victor blocked him, his fury spilling over. "You Abbotts have done enough damage tonight," Victor snarled, his voice sharp enough to slice through bone. "You're not setting foot in that room." Billy tried to protest, but Nick backed Victor up, shoving him back with a glare. "Stay away, Billy. Jack and Kane already destroyed her life tonight. We won't let you finish the job."